The rain hammered against the windows of Kensington Palace as Prince William stared at the newspaper headlines spread across his desk. Each one told the same heartbreaking story that had been dominating the news for weeks. The economic crisis had hit Britain harder than anyone expected, and families across the country were struggling to put food on their tables. Kate entered the room quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. She noticed the troubled expression on her husband's face and set the cups down gently. The newspaper photos showed long queues at food banks, children wearing worn-out clothes to school, and elderly people choosing between heating their homes or buying groceries. "Look at this, Kate," William said, pointing to a particular article. "Mrs. Henderson from Manchester wrote to us. She's 78 years old and hasn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days because she spent her pension, money on medicine for her sick grandson." Kate sat down beside him and read the letter that had arrived that morning along with hundreds of others. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. Mrs. Henderson wasn't asking for money or special treatment. She was simply sharing her story, hoping that someone in power might understand what ordinary people were going through. "There are so many letters like this," Kate whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Families sleeping in their cars because they lost their homes. Children going to school hungry. Parents working 3 jobs and still not making enough to survive." William stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain create rivers on the glass. He thought about his own children sleeping safely upstairs, never having to worry about their next meal or whether they would have a roof over their heads tomorrow. The contrast felt overwhelming. "We have to do something," he said firmly, "but not in the usual way, not with formal ceremonies or official announcements. People are tired of empty promises from politicians and celebrities who don't really understand their struggles." Kate nodded, understanding exactly what her husband meant. They had attended countless charity events and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, but somehow it all felt distant from the real pain that families were experiencing every single day. "What if we just showed up?" Kate suggested quietly. "No cameras, no press releases, no royal protocols. What if we simply went to where people need help and rolled up our sleeves?" William turned to look at his wife, seeing the same determination in her eyes that he felt in his heart. They both knew that their royal duties came with certain expectations and traditions, but sometimes the most powerful action was the simplest one. That evening, they made a decision that would change everything. Instead of working through official channels or charitable organizations, they would take direct action. They would visit the places where help was needed most, not as royals on official visits, but as 2 people who genuinely cared about making a difference. They spent the next few hours researching food banks, homeless shelters, and community centers across the country. They read more letters from families in crisis and studied maps of the areas hit hardest by the economic downturn. By midnight, they had created a plan that was both simple and revolutionary. The next morning, William called his private secretary and made an unusual request. He wanted to clear his schedule for the next 2 weeks, with no official explanation given to the press. Kate did the same, arranging for their children to stay with trusted family members. As they prepared to leave Kensington Palace, both of them felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. They were about to step outside the protective bubble of royal life and enter the real world where people were struggling to survive. They had no idea that their quiet decision would soon touch the hearts of millions and restore hope to a nation that had almost forgotten how to believe in kindness. The sun had barely risen when William and Kate arrived at the Riverside Community Center in Birmingham. They had driven themselves, something that rarely happened, and parked their modest car between a rusty van and an old bicycle. The building looked tired, with peeling paint and cracked windows, but warm light glowed from inside. Sarah Mitchell, the center's director, was setting up tables for the morning food distribution when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around expecting to see one of her regular volunteers, but instead found herself face to face with the Prince and Princess of Wales. "Good morning," Kate said with a genuine smile. "We're here to help. What would you like us to do?" Sarah stood frozen for a moment, wondering if she was dreaming. She had been running the community center for 15 years, working 18-hour days to keep it going with almost no funding. She had written letters to politicians, applied for grants, and begged local businesses for donations, but she never imagined that royalty would simply show up at her door. Are you really here?" Sarah stammered. "We really are," William replied, already rolling up his sleeves. We read about the work you're doing here and we want to help. Not with speeches or photo opportunities, just with whatever needs to be done. Within minutes, they were carrying boxes of food from the storage room and setting up chairs for the families who would arrive soon. Kate worked alongside elderly volunteer Mary Thompson, who had been helping at the center since her husband died 5 years earlier. "I can't believe you're here," Mary whispered as they arranged canned goods on the tables. "My granddaughter thinks you're like a fairy tale princess, but here you are, getting your hands dirty just like the rest of us." "This is where we should be," Kate replied simply. "This is real life, and real life is where we want to make a difference." When the doors opened at 8 o'clock, families began streaming in. Single mothers with tired eyes, elderly couples counting every penny, young fathers who had lost their jobs through no fault of their own. At first, people didn't recognize William and Kate, who had dressed casually and were focused on serving food and listening to stories. It was 10-year-old Emma Rodriguez who first realized who they were. She had come with her mother, Maria, who worked 2 cleaning jobs but still struggled to feed her 3 children. Emma tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed. "Mama, that's the princess," she whispered loudly. "The one from TV." Maria looked up from the food table and gasped. Kate was spooning soup into containers while chatting with an elderly gentleman about his garden. She looked so natural and comfortable that Maria almost doubted her daughter's words. "Excuse me," Maria said hesitantly. "Are you really?" Kate looked up with warm eyes. "I'm Kate and this is William. We're just here to help today. What's your name?" Soon word spread through the line, but something remarkable happened. Instead of excitement or chaos, people became more curious and hopeful. They began sharing their stories more openly. Knowing that someone who could actually make a difference was listening, James Patterson, a former factory worker, told William about losing his job when the plant closed down. "I've been looking for work for 8 months, he said. "I never thought I'd need help like this, but here I am, trying to feed my family." William listened intently, asking questions and remembering details. He didn't offer empty promises or political solutions. Instead, he simply acknowledged the man's struggle and treated him with dignity and respect. By noon, the center had served over 200 people, and William and Kate had heard dozens of stories that would stay with them forever. They had helped pack grocery bags, served hot meals, and even helped organize a children's activity corner while parents waited in line. As they prepared to leave, Sarah pulled them aside. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "You have no idea what this means," she said. "Not just that you came, but how you came. You didn't treat these families like charity cases or photo opportunities. You treated them like human beings with dignity and worth." That afternoon, as William and Kate drove to their next destination, they sat in comfortable silence, both processing what they had experienced. They had always known intellectually that people were struggling, but seeing it firsthand, hearing the stories directly, and working alongside volunteers who gave everything they had was completely different. "We can't stop here," William said finally. "This has to be just the beginning." Kate nodded, already thinking about the next community center, the next group of families who needed to know that someone cared about their struggles. They had discovered something powerful that day, something that would change not only their own lives but the lives of countless others across the country. 3 days later, William and Kate found themselves in a completely different environment. The homeless shelter in Manchester was housed in an old church basement, with rows of thin mattresses and a small kitchen that somehow managed to feed over 100 people each night. Father Michael O'Brien, who had been running the shelter for 20 years, was ladling soup when he noticed 2 new volunteers quietly washing dishes in the corner. He did a double take, then continued serving, deciding not to make a fuss. He had learned that sometimes the most meaningful help came from the most unexpected places. "First time volunteering?" asked Tony Walsh, a former construction worker who had been staying at the shelter for 3 months after losing his apartment. He was helping William stack clean bowls, unaware of who he was talking to. "Something like that," William replied with a smile. "How long have you been here?" Tony's face grew serious. "Since July. Lost my job when the construction company went under, couldn't make rent. Been trying to get back on my feet, but it's harder than people think. Father Michael lets me help out in the kitchen in exchange for a meal and a bed." As the evening progressed, William and Kate heard story after story that challenged everything they thought they knew about homelessness. There was Jennifer, a former nurse who lost everything when medical bills from her cancer treatment bankrupted her family. Robert, a veteran who struggled with injuries and couldn't find work that accommodated his physical limitations. And Susan, a teacher who became homeless when her school closed and she couldn't find another position. "People think we're all addicts or lazy," Jennifer told Kate as they folded blankets together. "But most of us here are just regular people who hit a bad stretch of luck. One medical emergency, one job loss, one family crisis, and everything falls apart faster than you can imagine." Kate listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and offering genuine empathy. She learned that Jennifer had been sleeping in her car for weeks before finding the shelter, driving to the library each day to use the computer for job applications, and showering at a local gym with a day pass she could barely afford. Meanwhile, William was helping serve dinner when he met Arthur, a 73-year-old man who had been forced out of his apartment when his rent was doubled. Arthur had worked as a maintenance supervisor for 40 years, but his small pension wasn't enough to keep up with rising costs. "I never thought I'd end up here," Arthur said quietly, accepting his plate of food. "Worked my whole life, paid my taxes, raised 3 kids. But when you're old and poor, people look right through you like you don't exist." That night, as the shelter settled into quiet, William and Kate helped distribute extra blankets and listened to the sounds of people trying to find comfort on hard floors. They stayed until after midnight, making sure everyone had what they needed and simply being present for those who wanted to talk. The next morning brought a surprise that changed everything. A young woman named Lisa Davis was outside the shelter with her phone, looking confused and excited. She had been one of the people served dinner the night before, and she had quietly taken a photo of Kate helping in the kitchen. "I wasn't going to post this," Lisa explained to Father Michael, "but my sister saw it and she said people need to know. She said this gives her hope that someone in power actually cares about people like us." By noon, the photo had spread across social media with a simple caption: "The Princess of Wales serving dinner at our local homeless shelter. No cameras, no press, just kindness." People began sharing their own stories of seeing William and Kate at community centers, food banks, and shelters across the country. The responses were immediate and overwhelming. Other volunteers began posting photos and videos of the royal couple quietly helping wherever they could. There was William teaching children to read at an after-school program in Liverpool, Kate organizing donations at a clothing bank in Cardiff, both of them painting walls at a youth center in Glasgow. But what moved people most wasn't just seeing royalty doing ordinary work. It was seeing them do it with such genuine care and humility. In every photo and video, they looked comfortable and natural, as if serving others was exactly where they belonged. Social media filled with comments from people who had given up hope in their leaders and institutions. "If they can take time to care about real people, maybe things can change," wrote one user. "This is what leadership looks like," wrote another. "Not speeches and promises, but showing up and doing the work." The traditional media began picking up the story, but William and Kate refused all interview requests. They continued their quiet tour of community organizations, determined not to let publicity change their mission. That evening, as they drove toward their next destination, Kate looked at her phone and saw thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories of struggle and hope. One message stopped her cold. It was from Mrs. Henderson, the 78-year-old woman from Manchester whose letter had started their journey. "I saw the news about what you're doing," the message read. "For the first time in months, I believe that someone understands. Thank you for showing us that we matter." Kate showed the message to William, and for a moment they both sat in silence, overwhelmed by the responsibility they had taken on and the impact they were already having. They realized that their simple decision to help had become something much bigger than they had ever imagined. By the second week of their quiet mission, something extraordinary began happening across Britain. The photos and videos of William and Kate working alongside ordinary volunteers had inspired others to take action. Community centers that had struggled for volunteers suddenly found themselves with more help than they could handle. At the Riverside Community Center in Birmingham, Sarah Mitchell arrived one morning to find a line of people waiting outside. But these weren't families seeking help. They were people wanting to volunteer. A retired teacher, a group of university students, a businessman who had taken time off work, and dozens of others who had seen the news and decided they wanted to be part of something meaningful. "We saw what the prince and princess were doing," explained David Chen, an accountant who had driven from London. "If they can take time from their busy schedules to help people, so can we. We want to make a difference, too." The same scene was playing out all over the country. Food banks that had operated with skeleton crews suddenly had armies of volunteers. Homeless shelters received donations of food, clothing, and money from people who had never given to charity before. Youth programs found themselves with new mentors and supporters. But perhaps most importantly, people who had felt invisible and forgotten began to feel seen and valued. The simple act of witnessing royal family members treating them with dignity and respect had restored their sense of worth. Meanwhile, William and Kate continued their journey, unaware of the movement they had sparked. They were in Edinburgh, working at a center that helped families facing eviction. The stories they heard there were particularly heartbreaking. Working families who had fallen behind on rent due to unexpected medical bills or job losses, facing the prospect of losing their homes. Rebecca Stewart, a single mother of two, was meeting with a counselor when Kate sat down beside her. Rebecca was trying to find emergency housing after receiving an eviction notice, and the stress was overwhelming. "I worked 2 jobs, Rebecca explained through tears. "But when my daughter needed surgery, I had to take unpaid leave and we fell behind. Now they're saying we have to be out by Friday, and I don't know where to go." Kate listened as Rebecca described sleeping in her car with her children, moving from friend's couch to friend's couch, and trying to maintain some stability for her kids while feeling completely lost herself. "You're not alone," Kate said simply. "And you're not a failure. You're a mother doing everything you can for your children under impossible circumstances." Those words broke something open in Rebecca. For months, she had felt like she was drowning, carrying all the shame and stress by herself. Having someone acknowledge her struggle without judgment felt like a lifeline. Across the room, William was helping Mark Thompson fill out applications for emergency assistance. Mark had been a successful electrician until a workplace accident left him unable to do his job. Workers' compensation barely covered his medical bills, and his savings had run out months ago. "I built things my whole life," Mark said bitterly. "Fixed people's problems, made their homes safe and comfortable. Now I can't even keep my own family housed." William didn't offer empty reassurances or false optimism. Instead, he simply listened and helped Mark navigate the complex system of forms and requirements needed to access help. When Mark's hand shook too badly from his injury to write clearly, William quietly offered to fill out the forms for him. That afternoon brought unexpected news. The center's director received a call from someone claiming to represent several local businesses who wanted to help. Word had spread about the royal visit, and companies were offering everything from job opportunities to housing, assistance for families in crisis. "People want to help," the director explained to William and Kate. "Your being here has shown them that this isn't someone else's problem. It's everyone's responsibility." But the most powerful moment came that evening, when Rebecca Stewart approached Kate as they were preparing to leave. She was holding an envelope. "I wanted you to have this," Rebecca said. "It's a letter I wrote to my daughters, explaining what happened to us and why we lost our home. I was going to give it to them when they're older so they'd understand. But after talking to you today, I realized I don't want this to be our story anymore." She tore the letter in half. "I want to write them a different letter, one about how we survived this, how we found help, and how people cared enough to make sure we didn't face it alone." As they drove away from Edinburgh that night, William and Kate found themselves changed by each encounter. They had started this journey wanting to help others, but they were discovering that it was transforming them as well. Each person they met taught them something new about resilience, dignity, and hope. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages from their staff, reporting on the wave of volunteerism and charitable giving spreading across the country. News outlets were calling it the royal ripple effect, but William and Kate barely paid attention to the headlines. They were too busy planning their next stops and thinking about the people they had met. Rebecca and her daughters, Mark and his family, Arthur at the homeless shelter, Mrs. Henderson with her letters. Each person had become real to them in a way that formal reports and statistics never could. "We can't go back to the way things were before," Kate said as they pulled into their hotel parking lot. "Not after seeing what we've seen." William nodded, already knowing that this journey had changed their understanding of their role and their responsibility. They were no longer just ceremonial figures. They had become part of something much larger and more important than they had ever imagined possible. The call came on a Tuesday morning as William and Kate were preparing for their final week of visits. It was from Rebecca Stewart, the single mother they had met in Edinburgh, and her voice was filled with excitement and disbelief. "I got the job," she said, barely able to contain her tears. "One of the businesses that heard about the center offered me a position with flexible hours so I can take care of my daughters. And there's emergency housing available until I can save enough for a deposit on a proper flat." Kate felt her own eyes filling with tears. "Rebecca, that's wonderful news. How are your daughters doing?" "They're so relieved," Rebecca replied. "Lucy, my oldest, said she feels like we can finally breathe again. And Emma drew you a picture to say thank you. She said you helped Mommy remember how to smile." This was just one of hundreds of similar calls and messages William and Kate had received over the past few days. The movement they had inadvertently started was creating real change in individual lives and entire communities. The transformation was visible everywhere they went. The food bank in Newcastle had expanded from serving 50 families a week to over 300. But they now had enough volunteers and donations to meet the increased demand. A homeless shelter in Cardiff had received enough funding to stay open 24 hours instead of just at night. Youth programs across the country reported having more mentors and resources than ever before. But perhaps most importantly, the conversation about poverty and struggling families had changed. Instead of statistics and political debates, people were talking about neighbors and community members who needed support. The shame and stigma that had surrounded asking for help was beginning to fade. On their final day of visits, William and Kate returned to the Riverside Community Center in Birmingham, where their journey had begun. Sarah Mitchell greeted them with a smile so bright it could have powered the building. "Come and see," she said, leading them through doors they had never noticed before. The center had expanded into the empty shop next door. Where once there had been bare walls and broken windows, there was now a bright space filled with computers for job searching, a children's reading corner, and tables where volunteers were helping people fill out applications and write resumes. "We call it the Hope Wing," Sarah explained. Local businesses donated everything: the computers, the furniture, even the paint on the walls. And we have volunteers here every day, teaching computer skills, helping with job interviews, providing childcare so parents can focus on finding work. In the corner, they recognized Mary Thompson, the elderly volunteer who had worked alongside Kate on their first day. She was reading to a group of children while their parents attended a job skills workshop. "Mary has become our reading coordinator," Sarah said. "She says helping here gives her purpose and makes her feel needed. The children adore her." As they walked through the center, William and Kate were struck by the energy and hope they felt everywhere. This was the same building they had visited 2 weeks ago, but it had been completely transformed. More importantly, the people had been transformed too. They met familiar faces with new stories. James Patterson, the former factory worker, had found employment with one of the businesses that had reached out to help. Arthur from the homeless shelter had been connected with subsidized housing for seniors. Jennifer, the former nurse, had been hired by a local clinic that needed experienced staff, but it was Mrs. Henderson who provided the most moving moment of the day. The 78-year-old woman from Manchester had made the journey to Birmingham specifically to thank them in person. She arrived with her grandson Tommy, the boy she had been buying medicine for instead of food for herself. "He's doing much better now," she explained, watching Tommy play with the other children. "The medicine is working, and we've been connected with programs to help with the costs. But more than that, I don't feel alone anymore. There are people checking on us, neighbors bringing groceries, and Tommy has friends to play with here at the center." She pressed a small, wrapped package into Kate's hands. "It's not much, just some biscuits I made. But I wanted you to know that your kindness saved us, not just from hunger or loneliness, but from despair." That evening, as news crews gathered outside the center for the first time since the story had begun, William and Kate faced a decision. They could continue to avoid the spotlight and keep their work quiet, or they could use the attention to amplify the message that had emerged from their journey. They chose to speak, not about themselves, but about the people they had met and the communities that had opened their hearts. "We started this journey because we received letters from people who were struggling," William said to the gathered reporters. "What we discovered was not just need but incredible strength, dignity, and hope. These communities have shown us what's possible when people come together to care for one another. Kate added, every person we met had something valuable to offer, even in their darkest moments. They didn't need our pity. They needed our respect, our support, and our recognition that their lives have worth and meaning. But they also made it clear that this was not the end of their involvement. This isn't a 2-week charity project, William said firmly. This is how we want to live and work from now on. These communities, these families, these individuals, they're not causes to us. They're our neighbors, our fellow citizens, and our friends. As they drove away from Birmingham that night, the back seat of their car filled with thank you cards, children's drawings, and small gifts from grateful families. William and Kate reflected on how completely their lives had changed. They had set out to help others and ended up discovering a new understanding of their own purpose and responsibility. The quiet action they had taken, born from genuine compassion and a desire to make a real difference, had sparked something far beyond what they could have imagined. They had not just helped individual families, they had helped restore faith in the possibility of positive change and the power of human kindness. 6 months later, the impact of William and Kate's quiet revolution continued to ripple across Britain and beyond. What had started as a simple decision to help had grown into a nationwide movement that transformed not just individual lives, but entire communities and the way people thought about service and responsibility. The numbers told part of the story. Volunteer registrations at community organizations had increased by over 400%. Donations to local charities had tripled. More importantly, the rate of families finding permanent housing, stable employment, and long-term support had improved dramatically across the country, but the real story was in the personal transformations that continued to unfold every day. Rebecca Stewart stood in the doorway of her new apartment, watching her daughters play in their own bedrooms for the first time in over a year. The job she had found through the Edinburgh Centre had led to a promotion, and she was now training other single mothers in job skills and interview techniques. I never thought I'd be in a position to help other people, she told the local newspaper, but experiencing that kindness when I needed it most taught me that we all have something to offer no matter what our circumstances. Mrs. Henderson had become a local celebrity in Manchester. Her weekly baking sessions at the community centre drew dozens of people, and she had started a program teaching cooking skills to families on tight budgets. Her grandson Tommy, now healthy and thriving, often helped her in the kitchen. Agnes Henderson has become the heart of our community, said the center director. She shows everyone that age and circumstances don't define what you can contribute. Her wisdom and kindness have touched hundreds of lives. The transformation was perhaps most visible at the Riverside Community Center in Birmingham. What had started as a simple food distribution site now housed job training programs, childcare services, financial counseling, and even a small medical clinic staffed by volunteer doctors and nurses. Sarah Mitchell had been invited to speak at conferences across Europe about community-based support systems. The key, she always told audiences, was realizing that everyone has dignity and value. When you treat people that way, amazing things happen. Tony Walsh, the former construction worker they had met at the homeless shelter, had not only found stable housing and employment, but had become a peer counselor for other people experiencing homelessness. His lived experience, combined with training he received through new support programs, made him uniquely qualified to help others navigate the system. Having someone who's been where you are makes all the difference, he explained. I can tell them that things can change because I'm living proof of it. The ripple effects had spread far beyond Britain's borders. Similar grassroots movements had emerged in countries around the world, inspired by the simple model of direct service and genuine connection. Community leaders in Australia, Canada, and several European countries had implemented programs based on the British example. William and Kate had quietly continued their work, making regular visits to communities across the country. They had learned to balance their traditional royal duties with their commitment to hands-on service, often fitting volunteer work into their official schedules. Their children had begun joining them on some visits, learning about service and community responsibility from an early age. Prince George had become particularly attached to the reading program at a London community centre, while Princess Charlotte enjoyed helping with children's activities. We want our children to understand that service isn't something you do occasionally, Kate explained during a rare interview. It's a way of living that recognizes our connection to and responsibility for each other. The most profound change, however, was in the national conversation about poverty, community, and responsibility. The crisis that had seemed overwhelming and hopeless just months before was now viewed through a lens of possibility and collective action. Government policies had begun to shift, influenced by the demonstrated success of community-based programs. Instead of top-down solutions, new initiatives focused on supporting local organizations and empowering communities to address their own needs. "What we learned," said a government spokesperson, "is that the best solutions often come from the communities themselves when they're given proper support and resources." On the first anniversary of their initial visit to the Riverside Community Center, William and Kate returned to Birmingham. They found a celebration in progress, not just marking the anniversary, but celebrating the opening of similar centers in 12 other neighborhoods across the city. The walls were covered with photos and thank you notes from families whose lives had been changed. Children who had been hungry were now thriving in school. Parents who had been unemployed had found meaningful work. Elderly people who had been isolated were now central parts of their communities, but perhaps the most powerful display was a simple bulletin board titled "Paying It Forward." It was covered with notes from people who had received help and were now helping others. Former clients had become volunteers, recipients had become donors, and people who had once felt hopeless were now sources of hope for others. As William and Kate walked through the celebration, greeting old friends and meeting new faces, they reflected on the journey that had brought them here. What had started as a response to heartbreaking letters had become a transformation of their understanding of leadership, service, and human potential. "We thought we were going to help other people," William said to Kate as they watched children play games while their parents shared stories and resources. "We had no idea they were going to save us." The quiet action that had sparked tears of despair had become tears of joy, hope, and profound gratitude. More importantly, it had proven that even in the darkest times, ordinary acts of kindness and service could create extraordinary change. The revolution they had started with simple compassion and genuine care had shown that everyone, regardless of title, wealth, or position, had the power to make a meaningful difference. All it required was the willingness to see others as they truly were, human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and hope. As the evening drew to a close and families headed home to safe, warm houses with full refrigerators and bright futures ahead of them, the true measure of success was visible in the smiles, the laughter, and the unshakable belief that tomorrow would be better than today.